So as we kind of bring everything back to this reproductive axis of the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the gonad, it's really important to just make sure that you have a good understanding that the hormone GnRH is being produced from the hypothalamus. It is being secreted in the hypophyseal portal system that will take that GnRH to the anterior pituitary lobe. And GnRH will then bind to its receptor on the gonadotrope cells, where we will see an increase in the synthesis and the release of FSH and LH. And once FSH and LH is released from the anterior pituitary lobe, it's going to travel in the blood system to the ovary or the testes, depending on if we're in a male or a female. So please just remember to keep these things in perspective as we move along. All right, so as we start looking at the bigger picture and application of this material, here are some questions for you to consider that will help aid in your understanding of this material. So why is gonadotropin releasing hormone able to stimulate the release of LH and FSH? And so the answer to that question is that the anterior pituitary gonadotrope cells have receptors for the hormone GnRH. And so GnRH doesn't stimulate oxytocin release because it's actually only targeting its cells in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. It has no receptors on cell types in the posterior lobe, and the posterior lobe is where oxytocin will be released. So hormone receptors play a role in whether or not a hormone is capable of causing a response. So a hormone can only be effective in a target tissue if there is a receptor present for it to bind to. And so we see high levels of LH and FSH in steers, wethers, geldings, and barrows, so animals that have been castrated. Okay, so my question for you is, do these hormones actually cause a response? And if you're really wanting to master this material, I would encourage you to pause the video here and think on this question. Okay, and so I'm going to wait just a few seconds for you to do that. All right, so why or why not is FSH, or does it cause a response in these castrated males? And the reason goes back to this concept of hormone receptors. So LH and FSH is being secreted out of the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which is still intact, even in castrated males. But the gonads have been removed from these castrated males. Therefore, the target tissue that has the cells that will bind LH or FSH have been removed. So LH and FSH do not cause a response in steers, wethers, geldings, and barrows because we've removed the target tissue. There's nothing for LH and FSH to bind to in the gonad. All right, so just a quick note, keep in mind that during the estrus cycle, there's going to be times when a hormone is present in the blood, but you actually don't get a response because the receptors are not yet present on the cells. And we're going to look at this more in depth as we work through cyclicity, the luteal phase, and the follicular phase in chapters 7, 8, and 9, respectively. All right, so a few other comments about the anterior pituitary hormones. FSH function is really geared towards the growth of the follicle on the gonad. So FSH is going to be released from the anterior pituitary gland, travel in the bloodstream down to the ovary, and is going to bind to cells in the ovary to stimulate growth of the follicle. And as the follicle is growing, then we will see an increase in the amount of estradiol that's being produced from testosterone. So estradiol and testosterone are both steroid hormones. They only differ in their structure by one carbon, and we'll look at those structures in subsequent videos. But estradiol can't be produced without testosterone. And so aromatase is the enzyme that will actually be activated to clip testosterone into estradiol. And so we'll see increasing amounts of estradiol when FSH is high in the bloodstream. FSH will also stimulate the production of inhibin. So inhibin is another hormone that's produced by the ovary and in the testes that is a feedback to the anterior pituitary gland. And so it's one of those hormones that really causes kind of a check and a balance. So it's a regulatory hormone. FSH in the male will also stimulate spermatogenesis. So FSH will bind to Sertoli cells to initiate the process of spermatogenesis. And so keep in mind, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. It was identified in the female first, therefore it was named after what it did in the female, but the same hormone exists in the male as well. We just call it the same thing, with the realization that it's targeting Sertoli cells in the testes and not follicles. So finally, FSH will also stimulate receptors for LH to form on granulosa cells of dominant follicles on the ovary. And this is in preparation for ovulation. And we're going to study that relationship actually a lot more in depth when we get to folliculogenesis. So just a few comments about LH. LH is a really powerful hormone as well, and its key role is in ovulation. So we refer to LH as the pre-ovulatory LH surge. And so large amounts of LH in the female will occur right before ovulation does. And so LH will be dumped into the blood system from the anterior pituitary, travel in large quantities to the ovary that has a dominant follicle on it, and will bind to its receptor on the granulosa cells. So that's GC here. LH will also have progesterone production function as well. And so progesterone will be produced by corpus luteum, or by the corpus luteum, because it binds luteal cells, and LH plays a role in that production as well. And we will see LH bind its receptor on the theca interna cells to stimulate production of testosterone, which will, and this is happening in the follicle. And so when LH binds its receptor on the theca interna cells of the follicle, that theca interna cell will produce testosterone. Testosterone will be secreted out of the cell, cross the basement membrane in the follicle to the granulosa cell, where it is taken into the granulosa cell and then converted to estradiol. So the process of converting testosterone to estradiol actually happens in the granulosa cell. But all of these events, the theca interna cells and the granulosa cells, are actually located in the follicle of the ovary. And so in the male, LH has a little bit of a different function. So LH in the male will stimulate testosterone production by binding to the LH receptor on the Leydig cells. All right, so just to talk to you a little bit about that relationship with LH causing the production of testosterone and then estradiol in the female, that relationship is actually really well illustrated in this follicle. So just to orient you to what's happening here, this is an antral follicle on an ovary in a female. And so we've got a couple of things that are going on in here. First of all, this big yellow area here, this is kind of the center of that follicle. It's filled with a lot of serum, nutrients, and some other cell types as well. But the cell type that is around the egg, which is right here in the center, is the granulosa cells. And so these granulosa cells are on the inside of the basement membrane, which here is shown as that dark purple circle that encompasses the entire follicle. And then the long ship-looking cells on the outside of the basement membrane there, those are theca interna cells. So what ends up happening here is that LH, shown here in yellow, is, keep in mind, it stands for luteinizing hormone. It is produced in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone binding to its receptor on the gonadotrope cells in the anterior pituitary. Okay, that stimulates synthesis or production of LH plus the release of LH. So when LH enters the bloodstream, it is going to travel to this ovary where the follicle's at. It's going to bind to its receptor, which is shown here in gray. And its receptor is on the theca interna cell. And that kicks off this messenger system, the secondary messenger system here. And so in that secondary messenger system, we have cyclic AMP being converted to protein kinase, which stimulates the upregulation of cholesterol. And cholesterol is derived, it will be modified through enzymes and formed into testosterone. And then testosterone is going to bounce out of this theca interna cell as the product. Oops, sorry. And will then go into the granulosa cell. So it crosses the basement membrane that is here. And at this point in time, testosterone, once it's in the cell, it kind of sets tight until FSH, which is also coming from the anterior pituitary gland, travels in the blood system and binds to its receptor, shown in gray here as well, on the granulosa cell. And that starts a whole secondary messenger system as well. So cyclic AMP gets converted to protein kinase that upregulates aromatase, which converts testosterone into estradiol. And estradiol leaks out of the granulosa cell into the blood system and goes to all these target tissues. So it goes to the brain, so it will go to the hypothalamus, which is where we'll see lordosis happening, so the female in a mating posture. Estradiol will also go to certain parts of the reproductive tract, like the uterine horns and the uterus, where it's going to get a lot of tone and be very rigid and start with contractions to help facilitate sperm cells moving its way through the uterine wall, or the uterus and the uterine horns. Estradiol will also come down here and stimulate mucus production by the cervix and the vagina as well. So this is just one relationship that is triggered by LH and that is aided by FSH. And keep in mind that these are way down the line in the reproductive tract. And LH and FSH are produced clear up just below the brain tissue. So these hormones are really, really, really effective all over or throughout the body in small quantities. All right, so as we look at hormones that are produced by the gonads, both the ovary and the testes, these are what we call gonadal hormones. And so they affect functions in the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, as well as the reproductive tissues of the repro tract. These gonadal hormones are really important because they actually serve as a feedback mechanism to the hypothalamus. And so that feedback can be either negative or it can be positive. It just depends on the hormone, the state of cyclicity, etc. And so gonadal hormones are really important because they are going to help the animal portray secondary sex characteristics. And so one of the easiest ones to remember is in a mature bull, they actually get a crustiness around their neck. That is in response to testosterone production, because they're an intact male who's producing sperm cells and going through spermatogenesis and producing, their gonads are producing lots of testosterone. So one of the effects of that testosterone is additional crustiness and tissue around the neck muscles. And so that's a secondary sex characteristic. So the gonadal hormones here tend to be either protein based or steroid based. And so the protein based gonadal hormones are called polypeptides, meaning that they are peptides or short proteins that are connected together. And so poly meaning many, peptide meaning small protein. And so the gonadal hormones that are polypeptides are hormones like relaxin, which is secreted by the corpus luteum when a female is pregnant. And relaxin is a key regulator of the parturition process. So it actually helps the muscles and the ligaments relax so that the female can pass the fetus through the birth canal. The other polypeptide that is produced by the gonads is inhibin. We've already mentioned inhibin a little bit, but it actually is going to feed back in response to the production of follicle stimulating hormone. And it's going to feed back to the anterior pituitary and inhibit FSH release. So inhibin is a really short negative feedback mechanism. On the steroid side, some of the gonadal steroids that are produced are things that you might be a little bit more familiar with. So androgen is going to be produced by the steroids, and that will get cleaved into testosterone. Estrogen, or what you may hear me refer to as estradiol, because that's what I was trained to call it, because from a scientific basis, it is estradiol. We just make a general statement that it's estrogen. And then progesterone is another gonadal steroid that is produced in the testes and the ovaries. And so one thing to notice here is that the steroids are going to have characteristics that are associated with their name. So if you see something that has an "one" at the end, that is a steroid. So like progesterone, testosterone, those are both steroids. And so that's a characteristic of steroidal nomenclature. All right. Hormones that are produced in the uterus, and this is limited to the female because we still haven't figured out how to get a uterus into a male livestock animal where we could like up our production of calves and whatnot. Totally a joke. But in the uterine hormones, the uterine hormone that is going to be the most effective and cause the greatest change in cyclicity is prostaglandin F2 alpha that's produced by the uterus in response to an absence of pregnancy. And so PGF2 alpha is a luteolytic hormone that will be produced in response to that absence of pregnancy. It will then actually travel to the CL on the ovary and lyse the CL and kickstart the whole cycle again. The placental hormones are vast. The placenta is a cool organism. It's actually the only gland that the female isn't born with. And so this placenta grows in response to a pregnancy being in the uterus. And so it's really a cool thing, and it actually produces hormones. And so the placenta will produce steroids like progesterone and estrogen. It will also produce things like placental lactogen, which is really important in the development of the mammary gland. In the horse, or in the mare, it's going to produce equine chorionic gonadotropin, or ECG, which will stimulate the ovary. And it will also produce human chorionic gonadotropin, which stimulates the ovary and serves as the maternal recognition of pregnancy hormone in the woman. All right, so that gives you a good idea of the source that a lot of these hormones are coming from, the tissue that they're coming from, and some of their downstream effects. And so this is one way to classify these reproductive hormones. So it's important that you get a good handle on the tissues that produce these reproductive hormones.